Chapter 1. Will you have my baby? Gail Henderson abruptly began to loudly choke on her iced tea. All around her, conversation ceased as they became the center of attention. As she coughed and wheezed with tears streaming down her eyes, she squinted at her best friend. Crystal Jabbar sat, calm as you please, as though she hadn't just dropped what amounted to a nuclear bomb into the conversation. They were seated at a table in Golden Corral, sharing lunch after a hectic morning of Christmas shopping. The holiday was only a few weeks away. The place was packed, as usual. The other diners slowly turned their attention to their own tables when Gail glared. Since no one had offered their assistance, she knew they were just being nosy. "I've given this a lot of thought. You know I can't have children. If you had one for me, I would have the best of both worlds. A child created by the man I love more than anything, and my best friend, who is like a sister to me," her friend continued. Crystal had been pregnant several times. Each one had ended in miscarriage, the last almost taking her life. Afterwards, her husband Rashid put his foot down. No more pregnancies. Crystal told Gail he'd threatened to get a vasectomy before allowing her to risk her life again in another pregnancy attempt, and she'd reluctantly complied with his decree. Gail thought Crystal had resigned herself to her barren state, but apparently not. "What do you mean, have a baby for you?" she cautiously asked, blotting the tears from her eyes and face. Crystal leaned forward in her chair, her gaze intent. "I want you to be my surrogate. I've been looking into it. Rashid would be its father and we'd use your eggs. Once the baby was born, I'd adopt it, making me its legal mother, and as my best friend, you'd naturally be its godmother." Gail pushed back a few inches from the table, unconsciously trying to place more distance between them. "Isn't this kind of drastic? I thought you were considering adoption," she asked a bit desperately. Crystal frowned. "I did, but that's not for me. I want a child of my own. At the very least, I want a child fathered by Rashid. You know how important family is to him. Do you really think he'd be satisfied with an adopted child?" Rashid Al-Jabbar was an Arab American, and his behavior was strongly influenced by the male-dominated culture in which he grew up. Because of his heritage, family and children meant a great deal to him. "Crystal, you know that's not fair to Rashid. He loves you. If you wanted to adopt, he would go along with it just because it made you happy." A brilliant smile lit Crystal's face. "Yes, he does love me, doesn't he? That's why I want this so much. I need to give him the child he so desperately desires. Hopefully it will be a son, to carry on his family name." Crystal reached out and gripped Gail's hand. "Gail, please. You're my best friend in the world. There's no one else I would trust to do this for me." Gail pulled her hand free and motioned between the two of them. "Crystal, look at us. We look nothing alike. Don't you at least want someone who is similar in appearance to you?" Crystal was a short, curvy, natural blonde with pretty brown eyes. Gail was tall and slender with skin the color of nutmeg. Not only did they not resemble each other, they were from two different ethnic groups. Crystal was Caucasian while Gail was African American. Her friend airily waved her hand. "Hush, you know I don't care about things like that. Besides, who would know? Rashid is almost as dark as you." It was true. Rashid had the dark olive-brown complexion of a Middle Eastern man. Gail could feel herself caving. It's not that she didn't want to help her friend. She just had a bad feeling about it, and over the years, she'd learned to trust her instincts. She took in Crystal's pleading expression. "Have you discussed this with Rashid?" It was a last-ditch effort to avoid the inevitable. She'd never been able to say no to Crystal, and Crystal knew it. Crystal leaned forward again, determination showing in her eyes. "He'll agree, don't worry. How could he not? This is a win-win situation." Win-win for whom? Gail wondered. Then she sighed, knowing Crystal was right about Rashid. Crystal had him wrapped around her little pinky. "I'm not saying yes, but I'm not saying no. Let me look into it, do a little research. This is too big of a decision to make on the spur of the moment." Crystal squealed, causing the other diners to turn and stare again. She got up from her seat and ran around to hug Gail. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Gail returned her hug, But inwardly, a feeling of dread grew. She was going to say yes. She always did, but she sensed this time the results would be disastrous. As promised, Gail spent the next few weeks researching artificial insemination and surrogate mothers. She had a much better understanding of what she'd be getting herself into if she proved crazy enough to agree to Crystal's scheme. The problem was, she and Crystal had a long history together. It went all the way back to junior high when they'd first met in Mr. Peterson's third period gym class. They'd clicked, despite their obvious differences. Gail had been the serious, studious one, the straight-A student who always had a book in her hands and sat in the corner reading. She'd been on the debate team and the student council, and had even spent time working on the student newspaper. Crystal had been a social butterfly who'd coasted through life on her looks and charm. She'd been a cheerleader and had won prom queen 2 years straight in high school. She'd studied and kept her grades just high enough to prevent being placed on academic suspension. Being so different, they should have never become friends. Yet, those very differences are what held them together. Gail had caused Crystal to be more serious, and Crystal had helped Gail be more lighthearted. Somehow they'd maintained their close friendship, despite attending 2 different colleges, several hours away from each other. It was happenstance that they'd both ended up relocating to the same city after graduation. Crystal had married first, having met Rashid in college. Gail had met and married Jason a couple of years later. The 2 couples had interacted frequently, mainly due to the close friendship of the women. Crystal rejoiced with her when Gail had discovered she was pregnant, and cried with her 3 years later when she'd lost both her husband and their son, Marcus, in a fatal car accident. That had been 2 years ago. She and Crystal had supported each other through every crisis, sharing the laughter and the tears. Crystal had always been there for Gail in her time of need. How could she do any less for Crystal now? Gail traveled home to Alabama to spend Christmas with her parents, still no closer to a decision. The holidays were always rough. She couldn't help thinking about Jason and Marcus and what Christmas morning would have been like if they were still alive. Having family around helped her get through the season without depression overwhelming her. Christmas Day was boisterous as usual. All of her brothers managed to make it home with their wives, the last one arriving early that morning, just in time to exchange gifts. Later in the evening, when everyone had finally left, her father pulled her into his study. "So, you want to tell me what's bothering you, baby girl? You've been mighty quiet all day." She debated for all of a second the wisdom of saying anything, but her father had always been her confidant. "Crystal asked me to be a surrogate for her and Rashid, using my eggs." "Well now." Her father settled his large, burly frame into his leather recliner and stroked his chin. "That's quite a favor to be asking. Which way you leaning?" Gail settled on the floor next to him and laid her head on his knee. He immediately began stroking her hair. "I don't know. I feel for her, Dad, wanting a child so desperately, but I'm not sure this is the way. My gut tells me doing this would be a terrible mistake. But we've been friends for so long. She's always been there for me. Can I honestly deny her?" Gail looked up at him. Her father brushed her bangs off her forehead. "True, you 2 go way back, but sometimes you have to trust your instincts and look out for number 1. You've already lost 1 child. Can you handle losing 2? "But this baby wouldn't really be mine," she protested, not knowing whom she tried to convince, her father or herself. He arched a single eyebrow. "Blood will tell. It will grow in your body and have your DNA. And what about your mother and I? You weren't the only one affected by the loss of Marcus. He was our first and only grandchild. Now you're considering giving away another?" She hadn't factored her parents' feelings into her decision. Gail thought for a minute and bit her lower lip. "So you're saying I shouldn't do this?" "I'm saying it takes a strong woman to give away her own flesh and blood. Maybe your love for Crystal will carry you through. I don't know, but think very carefully before committing to do this. Some decisions, once made, can't be undone." His words stayed with her a long time. The first of the year arrived, and Gail knew she had to make up her mind. A month had passed, and it really wasn't fair to Crystal to put it off any longer. So having made her decision, she invited Crystal and Rashid over to her apartment for dinner. For food, she'd gone with the basics: steak, baked potatoes, and salad, knowing from experience neither Rashid nor Crystal ate pork. When they arrived, she opened the door and invited them in. Crystal searched her face anxiously, trying to see if the answer to her question was imprinted there. Gail kept her expression as impassive as possible. Though she had decided, there were still questions to be asked and details to be worked out. Crystal floated past in a floral chiffon dress that emphasized her femininity. Rashid looked as debonair as ever in a pair of black dress slacks and black dress shirt. After a quick glance at his face, Gail looked away from him and focused her attention on Crystal. Though she'd known the man for almost 10 years now, something about him still made her uncomfortable. She was considered tall for a female, standing 5'9" in her stocking feet, but Rashid towered over her by a good 6 inches. He was starkly handsome, with features that were rugged, harsh even, bringing to mind desert sheiks and tales of Arabian Nights. His hair was the blue-black of the deepest, darkest black, thick with a glossy sheen evident even with his short cut. "Come in. You want to eat first and then talk, or talk and then eat?" Gail left the choice up to them. "Oh, talk, definitely. What you're cooking smells heavenly, but I won't be able to eat a bite until I know," Crystal said decisively. Rashid, as usual, said nothing, willing to go along with whatever pleased his wife. Gail led them into the living room and sat in the recliner, while motioning them to the couch. After they were all seated, she turned to Rashid. "I've given it a lot of thought, but I have a few questions to ask before finalizing my decision." Crystal sat rigid on the edge of her seat, hands fisted on her lap. Rashid was a bit more relaxed, but just as intent in his focus on Gail. "What would you like to know?" "The first thing I need to know is, are you in total agreement with this plan? Is this something you really want to do? Because once we start, there will be no going back." She linked her fingers together and lowered her hands onto her lap, in an effort not to betray her nervousness. Rashid gave her question the serious thought it deserved. "I have reservations, naturally, but I've given it careful consideration. If you two ladies are willing, I'll go along. I know Crystal has her heart set on this course of action." "You know what's involved? All the testing that needs to be done to both of us and the legalities to be ironed out?" Gail wanted to be absolutely sure he knew what he was getting into. "Yes, I've researched everything and spoken to both my lawyers and personal physician. I know what's involved. Do you?" He continued to watch her closely. Gail nodded. "As much as I can without having actually gone through the experience myself. Crystal, are you sure this is what you want to do? A child is serious business. You can't change your mind midstream and decide you made a mistake once I'm pregnant. This is going to have a tremendous impact upon all of our lives." Crystal nodded emphatically. "Yes, I know what I want. I've given it a lot of thought and research. I won't change my mind." Gail heaved a big sigh and swiped her bangs out of her eyes. She prayed she was doing the right thing. Crystal could be flighty at times, but she seemed to genuinely have considered all of the ramifications and still wanted to proceed. "If you are sure, then I'll do it." Crystal bounded off the couch and rushed over to Gail, pulled her out of the seat and hugged her tight. Then she began dancing around, so excited she couldn't contain herself. "I'm gonna have a baby! I'm gonna have a baby!" she sang. Her happiness was contagious. Gail couldn't help but smile at her antics, despite her personal misgivings. She happened to glance at Rashid to see what his reaction was to all this. He was looking directly at her, not his wife, and the expression on his face sent a frisson of nerves tingling down her spine. Feeling like a specimen under a microscope, she quickly returned her attention to her friend. When Crystal calmed down, they went into the dining room to eat. The meal was a light-hearted affair, with the food being well received. As they were leaving, Rashid told her he would make all the arrangements and call her when it was time to meet with the lawyer. She agreed and closed the door behind them as they left, feeling like she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. While Rashid listened with half an ear to his wife's ramblings about her plans for the baby, his thoughts centered on Gail. Though she'd agreed to Crystal's request, he sensed she had as many reservations as he about the whole deal. It was nothing he could put his finger on, just a feeling no good would come of this. He'd resigned himself to being childless. He loved Crystal and hated seeing how her desire to make a family with him ate away at her. He had agreed with his plan because he wanted to see her happy again. After the last miscarriage, she had sunk into a depression from which she'd never fully recovered. He knew she felt defective, as though she was less of a woman because she couldn't bear him the children they so desired. Watching her almost bleed out had killed any wish he had lurking in his heart for a child birthed with his DNA. His wife was more important to him than any baby she could ever produce, but she didn't seem to understand. Hence, this plan of hers. He had nothing against Gail. She was a good woman who had been through a lot. Her husband, Jason, had been a good friend, and Rashid still mourned his loss. He had made it a point to keep an eye out for Gail's well-being, just as he knew Jason would have done for him had their situation been reversed. He knew his wife well. She wasn't the most sensitive of beings. It would be up to him to make sure Gail didn't get hurt and was well taken care of during this process. She'd been through enough. After their meeting, things proceeded rather quickly. They met with a lawyer, and the terms of agreement shocked Gail so much she almost backed out. In addition to covering all legal and medical fees, which she expected, Rashid would pay all of her living expenses for the duration of her pregnancy and the 8-week recovery period after the delivery. Plus, he'd promised to invest an amount equal to her yearly salary into her stock portfolio, which his firm handled. "It's too much," she argued. "Is this even legal?" "These are my terms," Rashid said, refusing to budge. Sensing Gail was ready to withdraw from their agreement, Crystal stood suddenly, reached down, grabbed Gail by the arm, and pulled her from the room. As soon as the office door closed behind them, she pleaded, "Gail, please don't make a big deal out of this. Accept Rashid's offer. It's the least we can to recompense you for what you're willing to do for us, and it's not like we can't afford it." "It's not what you and I discussed," Gail said. "I know, but take it anyway." Gail scowled. "Fine, I'll agree. You'd better be glad I love you," she muttered as she spun on one heel and stalked back inside the lawyer's office. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," Crystal sang, trotting along behind her. Though she'd given in, it still rankled. In none of their discussions had compensation been mentioned, and if they had, she would never have agreed to it. Once the contract was signed, they'd gone from the lawyer's to Dr. Hagen's office for the first round of exams. Dr. Hagen was the specialist Rashid's personal doctor had recommended. A copy of her medical records had already been transferred. If everything checked out, the next step would be the monitoring of her body to determine her fertile period. 2 months later, she was back in Dr. Hagen's office with Crystal by her side, being inseminated. It was amazing how fast things could go when you had enough money to grease the wheels. Crystal was more nervous than she was, gripping her hand as though Gail were in labor rather than hopefully being impregnated. Amazingly enough, either she was extremely fertile or Rashid's sperm was potent because his seed took root the first time. 2 weeks later, they were having a celebratory dinner to the welcome news that 9 months from now, Crystal and Rashid would be the proud parents of a brand new infant. June, 2 months later. Gail awakened to the sound of raised voices. She was in the emergency room of Baptist Medical Hospital after having passed out at work. Rashid yanked back the curtain and strode to the bedside. She looked at him groggily. "Rashid, what are you doing here?" He came to a stop by the bed and put his hands on the rail, gripping it tightly. "Where else would I be when the safety of my child is threatened?" Gail grimaced and tried to sit up. "Be still," he commanded, and used the remote to raise the head of the bed. She studied his stern features before glancing away. "It was nothing. There was no need for you to come rushing down here. I simply fainted at work, and they overreacted. Before I could stop them, they'd called rescue." She worked as a paralegal for a major law firm. The last thing they wanted was to be named in a lawsuit. Being given no choice, Gail had reluctantly allowed herself to be carted off to the emergency room to be checked out. If she had known they were going to call Rashid, she'd have put up more of a fight. "That's not what the doctor said. Dr. Hagen says you're dehydrated and you're not eating enough. You've lost too much weight and are far weaker than you need to be." He eyed her steadily, his gaze daring her to deny it. Rat-fink doctor. Of course Dr. Hagen knew on which side his bread was buttered, since Rashid was the one paying his outrageous fees. She should have known the doctor would call him. She glanced behind him. "Where is Crystal?" Maybe she'd be more reasonable. "Waiting for me to bring you to the house." At that, her attention snapped to his face. "I'm not going to the beach. I'm headed home to my apartment when I leave here." He crossed his arms over his chest and glared down at her. "You either come with me so we can take care of you, or you'll stay here in the hospital. Doctor's orders. Now which will it be?" Gail stared at Rashid in horror. She didn't want to stay with them. This whole situation was awkward enough. "Why can't I go home?" She was startled to hear a whine in her voice. He planted his hands on the rail and leaned forward. "You can't go home alone because according to what you've told Dr. Hagen, you haven't been eating." "It's not my fault I can't keep anything down. Blame this child of yours." Gail placed her hand over her stomach. Rashid's eyes followed the motion of her hand, staring at her stomach for a few seconds before returning his gaze to her face. She was shocked to see the blatant possessiveness in his expression before he blanked it out. "I am blaming my child for this. That is why you are coming with me. I have a list of foods and beverages you should be able to tolerate, as well as your prescription for the anti-nausea medicine Dr. Hagen recommended. By the time we get to the house, Crystal will have everything prepared. We will care for you and see that you don't overdo it. For the next 2 weeks, you are restricted to bed rest." 2 weeks? She echoed. "What about my job?" "What about it? You're no good to them the way you are, and you definitely don't need the money. Don't you think your welfare and the health of this child are more important than your job?" He said sternly. Gail knew he was right, but things were changing too fast. She was trying to hold on to what was familiar with both hands, afraid if she didn't, she'd be swept away. When she'd agreed to be Crystal's surrogate, she'd forgotten the complete disruption pregnancy caused in a woman's life. She was only 2 months along, and already she was sick of all the hormonal changes this baby was taking her body through. Maybe she shouldn't have been so quick to reject the psychological counseling offered by Rashid's legal staff before she'd signed the agreement. "You're right," she finally told him. "I'm just trying to keep my life as normal as possible. Things just aren't happening the way I imagined. Your house is fine for now. We'll need to stop by my place so I can pack enough clothes to tide me over. I have enough leave time to cover the next 2 weeks. Actually, she had enough paid leave time to take off the next 6 months. Rashid gazed at Gail, silently acknowledging normal had gone out the door the minute he'd received the call from the doctor an hour ago. He hadn't known how much he wanted this child until he'd feared losing it. This emergency phone call had reminded him too much of the ones he'd received concerning Crystal. He sat silently listening while Dr. Hagen came in with final instructions, then left when the doctor did so Gail could dress. He wanted this baby. It shamed him to admit just how much he wanted it. He'd thought he could be satisfied with just the love of his wife, but now that his embryo was growing under the heart of another woman, he realized just how much he had deceived himself. Crystal had been right, not about being less of a woman because she couldn't give birth, but correct when she said he wanted a son, one to continue his family name. He would be happy with a daughter if that's what God chose to bless him with, but in his deepest heart, he wanted a son, a house full of them. He looked at the woman who had made all of this possible as she stepped from behind the curtain, and felt gratitude well up within his heart. She was going beyond the norms of friendship in doing this for them. For her to be willing to bear a child for someone else, especially knowing how devastating the loss of her own son had been for her, was beyond extraordinary. He'd never really given much thought to his wife's friend. At first, Gail had come with the territory, a kind of love me, love my friend package he had accepted when he married Crystal. Then he'd met Jason, and by virtue of familiarity, the men became good friends. At that point, Gail had simply been Jason's wife. As men do from time to time, they'd spoken of their wives and families, and he'd known Gail was a good wife. Jason never had anything but good to say about her as a wife and as a mother. Other than Crystal, Rashid really couldn't have picked a better or more honorable woman to be the mother of his child if he tried. This had to be difficult for Gail. Her routine, her very life was being disrupted by this pregnancy. She was basically giving up a year of her life to make their dream come true. Money couldn't compensate for this kind of love. He was going to do everything within his power to see she was well taken care of. It was the least he could do.